So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the School of Education Doctoral Student Colloquium series presentation. I am Christopher Wright, and I am going to be the faculty moderator this afternoon. We are pleased to welcome all of our virtual attendees, including School of Education faculty, staff, and students, the university body at large, like community members and partner associations, among others. The Doctoral Student Colloquium series offers the School of Education doctoral students an opportunity to share their original research and learn from their peers, faculty, and staff. Each month, one EDD and one PhD student presents their research at the colloquium, which is normally offered both on campus at Drexel and online through Zoom. However, due to COVID-19 pandemic, all colloquium events for the 21-22 academic year will be held virtually through Zoom. These sessions help doctoral students to connect with each other and develop a peer community that is invaluable in supporting their journeys in the program. Each doctoral student presenter is also asked to write a research brief that relates to his or her presentation, which is then included in an edited publication titled Doctoral Student Research Briefs, published on the School of Education's website. The research brief is a way to disseminate our doctoral students' research as shared in the colloquium in a concise format with relevance to education. Each presenter today will be provided 20 minutes to share his or her research. We will then move on to question and answers following each presentation. Please save your questions for the end. You're welcome to type your questions in the chat area of Zoom or to use your mic to ask the question. So this month, we're going to have just a slight change to that. So for our first speakers for the day, we actually have a group of PhD students in the School of Education who will be sharing some interesting experiences from their summer work. Each group will have approximately 5 to 7 minutes overview of their summer work, which will allow, again, for a short question and answer period following the presentations. Kimberly Sterin, one of our students in the in the PhD program, will be going first, followed by the group of Christopher Fornaro, Dara Bright, and Kate Fan, and Katrina Struloeff will close things out. So with that being said, I'd like to turn things over to Kimberly.
Great, thank you so much. So great to see everyone here today. Sorry, just getting my presentation up and ready for you. Give me 1 second. Sorry. All right. And I do have a resource that I'm going to share with everyone that I'm putting into the chat that has some links to some of the information that I will be sharing with you today. Okay, here we go. So this summer, I had the amazing opportunity to work with the Education Trust, and I'll be sharing a little bit about the organization and about my role as the P12 policy intern. So I'll talk about who they are, what they do, my role, the projects, and we'll have time for questions at the end. So the Education Trust is a national nonprofit. They have offices in DC, New York, Michigan, and California. They were started in the 1990s. Their mission is to close opportunity gaps that disproportionately affect students of color and students from low-income families. So they specifically target these groups through the education policy lens. They call themselves fierce advocates for the high academic achievement of all students, and again, particularly those of color and living in poverty. They're equity-driven, data-centered, and student-focused organization. For the structure, they have a senior leadership team, a communications and operations teams, a P12 policy and practice team, and that's the team that I was welcomed to join, a higher education policy and practice team, and then they have partnerships and engagement team. Some of the women on the screen. Ivy is my direct supervisor from this summer. And then Rachel with the yellow background is on our team, and Zahava in the top left with the blue background is also on our ed finance team. So kind of just putting also a face to this organization and showing you the wonderful people I've had the opportunity to work with. So what does EdTrust do? How do they fulfill this mission? So it's through a combination of research and advocacy. They are deeply research-based. There's a lot of staff members with PhDs throughout all the different teams, and then they combine it with this advocacy lens. So bringing the information and conclusions they get from the research studies to state partners, other advocacy organizations. I have a few of the example studies that I would definitely encourage you to take a look at, particularly the one in the middle called Going Beyond ESSA Compliance, a 50-state scan of school spending reports. That's something our team just put out in August. So it's still kind of new. And what I really like about this project is it's really helping you see on a national scale the spending, how you're doing on spending and how well you're complying with the regulations of ESSA. So then you can see your state and compare the states. And at the bottom, if you scroll down on the link that's in the resource guide, you have a take action. So if your state or a state is failing to comply with ESSA well, you immediately link so that you can send a letter to your state legislature. So again, like connecting the research to that advocacy lens. I highlighted a report about teacher diversity. Their equity line blog is something I would really encourage people to check out. And then another new study they put out, a natural fit placing after school staff of color in teacher pipelines is really interesting. And then I put a few of the partners, the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership and the Alliance for Resource Equity. Something I've really loved with working with EdTrust is getting insights to how many different organizations do their advocacy and how different organizations who also are approaching education with an equity lens and partnering with them. So like combining forces, if you will. In the very beginning, I got to comment on a letter, and this is why I have the Department of Ed on here, is because there's been a lot of collaborations with the Department of Ed at the federal level where we've been asked to either comment on legislation. So I got to comment on the school finance survey, which is one of the 3 ways we collect data on school finance at the federal level. And that was a great opportunity to see how that's done and how multiple organizations kind of combine forces. So we met with Learning Policy Institute, another youth advocacy organization. We all kind of said the same thing and then had different nuances depending on the different organization on what we were pushing the Department of Ed to make revisions in the school finance survey. So getting this internship, one of my values is to be very transparent, and I'm bringing that to this presentation into saying getting this internship took a lot of work. This is not something that fell into my lap. I was not given this. I applied to 10 internships in 2020 and then 8 this past summer, and then got this one through lots of networking, lots of cold call emails, phone calls, calling in favors from, like, I reached out to someone from high school on LinkedIn. It was just a lot of times of seeing how can I get my foot in the door? What connections can I make? And ultimately getting this internship, it was a combination of that networking work and finding the right fit for me, and crafting and recrafting my narrative in selling myself throughout this process of writing the cover letter, the writing samples, and the interviews. So absolutely happy to welcome and talk about that at some point. It was a virtual internship, but I did get to go to the office one day in July. And so that's that picture there. So what did I do? I was on 2 main projects, and then I had a bunch of, other little tasks as well. But the main project I worked on was the Strengthening K-12 School Funding Data Project. The purpose was to develop federal and state level recommendations for improving the quality and usability of school level spending data. with an emphasis on answering questions about whether spending varies strategically across school-based and school and student need. So through this project over the summer, I helped develop the interview protocol, the slide deck for the interviews, reaching out to the interviews. So we interviewed a bunch of different stakeholders. We interviewed, and we did focus groups as well. So we had researchers, we had education news writers, we had state level advocates, we had local level advocates, we had school leaders themselves. So getting a lot of different voices and thinking about what the data they use is, what they've seen in reporting well, and what they would really need and how that data can change to understand school spending better. So this is all really about shining that light on the data so that we can have good data, which is hard to do sometimes, and then use it effectively to really advocate and push for more equitable disbursements. The second big project I worked on, and there are links to this in the resource guide I provided, was the Fund Ed, which is part of Ed Build, which now that organization is going under a change. So if you do click on the links, at first it might give you like privacy warning, this is not secure. It's fine, you can bypass that. It's just because they're changing ownership. So this is an excellent tool and was probably the most challenging part of my internship, where they give very detailed state profiles of how every single state does their education funding. And so I work to update several states, and what we're doing is we're updating whatever the legislation has changed for the next legislative session in 2022. So the information right now is really from 2018, and by January, it will be completely up to date. So there's this national map, so you can see, most states in the United States use a student-based formula. And then you can go state by state and get the information on, oh, what does my state do for my English language learners? Are we funding them more? Where does our local tax revenue come from? What is the policy on charter schools? So please use this as a resource, and if you have any questions on navigating it, I'd be happy to work with you. Thank you so much, and I will pass it on to our next presenter.
Thanks, Kim. Let me see if I can get this. Can you all see that? Okay, like a thumbs up and down. No? Okay, cool. That didn't work. Thank you. Sorry, I'm having problems with OneDrive. Okay, we're just going to do it this way for sake of time. You can all see that, correct? And I will make it bigger so that hopefully you can see it better. Sorry about that. OneDrive has been causing me some issues lately. All right, so my name is Chris Fornaro. I worked in the methods lab this summer with Kate Fan, Dr. Tony May, and Tara Bright, and we're going to be presenting on cognitive interviewing in instrument development. So just to give a little bit of a background information, we worked with CyberCore Mentoring and Scholarship Program. It's a program at Drexel's College of Computing and Informatics. Currently, there's 2 cohorts of students engaged in this program, and they receive support and activities from College of Computing and Informatics professors. The program itself is designed to recruit, train, and mentor undergraduate student scholars to transition into cybersecurity positions within the federal, state, local, and tribal government organizations. So they're their own little cohort. They receive some extra services along with the typical CCI students. And really what we were trying to do and what we've been working on is to create an instrument development is part of the work relating to the evaluation of CyberCore that is funded through NSF. And the specific instrument we're working on is on validation theory, which is out of Brendan's work with community college students to validate students' experiences with success. And it does this in a couple of different ways. And this is the graphic here is how we've imagined it, in that there is both two different kinds of validation in academic and interpersonal. So academic is things that are relating to a student's academic work, and interpersonal is really the relationships that the students have with people within the university. And really the first level of that is having validation both in and out of the class. So recognizing students' good work, realizing their effort, and then that could lead to more involvement from the students, which will eventually lead into more learning and retention for those students. So like I said, we were trying to create this instrument, and we decided before embarking on doing the instrument development, we would do cognitive interviews. And really cognitive interviews were a way for us to have a pilot of our questionnaires by potential participants. We read through the tasks and provided feedback, and we revised the items on the instrument. And Daryl will talk more about that in a second. And this feedback from literature said that it helps refine wording and phrasing of items so that the participants and students and the research teachers have a shared understanding of the assessment items. So it's really making sure that like what we as researchers are believing we're asking is the way that students are interpreting those questions. And I'm going to pass it off to Dara from here.
Thanks, Chris. So the process for cognitive interviews, it started, we have the participant in a one-on-one session. We give them the task and the instructions, and we ask them to, as they read the item, to think aloud their thought process. So what thoughts came to you? How did you read this question? And as they responded to each item and explained their train of thought and how they understood the question, we would just ask follow-up questions. So was there anything confusing about this item? When you hear the word, is your professor accessible? What does that mean to you? And then we just kind of followed up, was this item difficult to respond? And so by doing this process, it allowed us to engage with the students and understand how our questions were being interpreted and the conception that people had, the perceptions that they had of this question. And so in the next slide, we talk about how we chose to validate our instrument or the survey that's under review. So we use the standards of education and psychology testing. And in those standards, they say to assess instrument rigor in the social sciences, we need to at minimum use 5 metrics. And so the 5 metrics are internal structure, relationship to other variables, content, consequential, and response process. And so for this presentation, we're just going to talk about 2 of the metrics that we use to validate our instrument. So for a response process, it's basically answering this question. So how well do our participants' responses align with the assessment construct? And so what we found was 91% of our responses actually aligned with what the researcher's intent, or what we intended for the survey question to actually ask, which means that as we constructed this survey, everyone largely understood what we were asking and what we were trying to get at. The questions that didn't meet that metric, we went back, we revised them, and then we rediscussed them with the students. And as we discussed them, we say, okay, so these are the examples that we're trying to, this is the bigger idea. So these are examples to help you get like clarity on the question. And when we did that and we kind of got feedback from the students were able to tell us, oh, I definitely understand. No, don't understand. I think you should rework this some more. And so the other metric that we use for validation evidence is consequential. And it's basically asking this question, does completing the assessment negatively impact participants? And so what we found was no participants or no respondents asked to stop the voluntary process. No one says, hey, these questions make me incredibly uncomfortable, or they just express discomfort anyway. These interviews were completed over Zoom, but we did give them the opportunity and space to, at any time, let us know whether they felt like they just didn't want to continue the process. And so these are just 2 of the metrics that we use to assess validity evidence of our survey.
Thanks, Sarah. So here on this slide, we're providing some specific examples of the items we revised based on our cognitive interview. And the revision usually happen due to some common issues, such as vague terms, confusing wording, or incomplete meanings. For example, the first row here, the curriculum reflects my personal background. Students pointed out that both the word curriculum and personal background are vague to them. And after our team discussion, we reached agreement that we want to substitute curriculum, which makes more sense to instructor or researchers, to classroom activities, which makes more sense to students. And then we add an explanation to personal background in brackets, indicating any life or academic experiences. And the second example here, and when I'm in class, I'm giving opportunity for personal reflection, and the students reported that personal reflections can have different interpretations. Some think of it as reflecting on their past experience, some think of it as reflecting on their grades. But the item we intended to ask about students' reflection on their learning or metacognition. So we revised the term to the item to my instructors give me time to think about my learning to make it more specific and clear. And the third example here is my background is seen as adding value to the class. It's also reported to be confusing by students because this does not indicate if background is seen by whom as adding value. Is it seen by students, by other students, by instructors, or by both? So our team decides then, since it's more like a self-perception item, the passive tense may not be necessary. So we ultimately want to know if students perceive themselves, their own background as adding value. This may be contributed by environmental factors such as their interactions with peers or faculty. So we change the passive tense to an active tense. And the last example here, my instructors discuss various career paths in classroom activities. This itself doesn't have much of an issue. We only tweak the wording from various to possible because we think that makes the career discussion more targeted to the course itself. Based on student feedback, we added another item that specifically talks about the students' individual professional aspirations to make it more individual focused and more consistent with the tones of other items in the instruments. And the next slide, we can see that conducting cognitive interviews like this can be very helpful in incorporating participant voices in our design of instruments. And this iterative process of revising items based on participant feedback can add to validity and reliability of the instrument. It can also provide a context for our further quantitative item analysis and validation. If we have a general idea about which items are marked or red flagged as confusing or inconsistent, if we find undesirable results from our quant phase, there are more reasons to then rewrite or remove those items. And lastly, cognitive interviewing is only one form of collecting validity evidence. Like Sarah just said, it's mostly targeted at the response process evidence that we discussed. And there are other forms of validity evidence. And our team so far have collected validity evidence for the content validity because we did expert panel review as well. And our next steps could be psychometric measures such as RASH measure or statistical measures to ensure that the other aspects of the instrument is valid. And that's it about our work, and we will welcome questions later.
And then on to Katrina. Thank you all.
Good afternoon, y'all. I'm probably going to talk a little fast because I have a lot to get through, but I will follow up with a link in the chat to make sure that if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. This summer, I participated as an Urban Leader Fellow with Urban Leader Fellowship, and my project was in educational policy in New Orleans. So just a little quick background on Urban Leader Fellowship. It's a competitive, fully funded, full-time 7-week summer fellowship program in 10 different cities. You can see the cities here. It's in its 10th year of operation. There's some fun facts on an infographic, but basically they've worked with over 600 people to have these summer roles in various cities impacting education and leadership. So it's based on a 3-pronged model. The first is policy advancement. So half of our time is working with policy leaders in every space. Another half of our time is with community impact and working with a nonprofit or a community agency. And then there's also components of people development. I'm going to focus on the policy advancement component that we did in New Orleans. So I was paired with Mr. Ethan Ashley, the school board president of New Orleans Public Schools. For those of you that don't know, New Orleans is near and dear to my heart. I lived there for 7 years before moving to Philly for this program. So I was very excited to be able to go back and work, at least virtually, with New Orleans Public Schools. It is a school district with 78 schools, and it is fully decentralized and all charter. So it's a very unique space. The driving questions we were looking at was working with their school board to find out how they could take their next steps in social equity and racial equity. And in doing that, they wanted to see how they could bring education and curriculum to the location of New Orleans that taught the local history with a lens that was different than historically taught, and how that could happen within a decentralized school district. So two key terms that I wanted to share and we really pressed were we suggested place-based education, which is about immersing students in local heritage, culture, landscapes, and experiences. This also has a very strong bend towards ecological integrity and community and economic viability. And then also shared history education, which is about showing the relationships between people, politics, and place. And this is actually based on a model from Oregon that's on tribal history. So the idea is you're once again pulling the native culture and land and integrating that into teaching history. So I'm not going to go through a whole problem statement, but the issues that we saw were that there was a lack of equitable education, there's a lack of cultural understanding. Many people who live in New Orleans don't know the history of New Orleans, particularly a lot of educators are transplants, and thus it doesn't get passed on to the students. And there's a lack of scripted interdisciplinary resources. So basically, teachers that aren't local are told, just go do it, and they don't have the resources, their tie-ins. So what we envisioned as the ideal here was to create a pre-K through 12 NOLA-based, place-based shared history lesson plan and resource space. So we can improve the understanding of connection and place. Research has shown that this improves academic performance for students and at the same time affirms their cultural identity and community pride. In addition, from an economic perspective, it creates a larger investment in their community and more people stay, which we all know is really important when it comes to brain drain and a number of other things. Methodology that we used was a literature survey. We also did interviews with some key stakeholders that we were able to get a hold of. We did a survey sent to educators, and we did case studies highlighting where this is working in other spaces. So our major recommendations for action were that we designed a school board resolution, and the main step of that was creating a working group of 10 to 12 local knowledge holders. So making sure that the people doing this were the local knowledge holders in the community, not necessarily the school board or other people that thought they were the experts, and bringing them together to create these lesson plans. We also were looking at a multi-policy approach. So we were increasing buy-in at multiple levels. Our interviews happened at schools, they happened at the district level, they happened at the charter district level, and then they also happened at the state level because Louisiana's in the process of revamping their state social studies curriculum. So we found that as a perfect avenue to fit in and create some great resources. We also have additional recommendations from survey responses and research. So here's a little tidbit of what we proposed to the board, our resolution, that's the process. Louisiana is under Napoleonic law, so they go through a different process than other states to get education policy pushed through. We were really excited about this, and it was a great opportunity to actually write policy that's been voted on. So this is actually up for vote this next week. It was a little delayed due to Hurricane Ida, but hopefully this will be moving forward since we have buy-in already from the board. Our multi-policy approach that I mentioned was a school district, individual schools and networks, and then Louisiana State Board of Education, which they have also been working with the School Board of New Orleans to move this forward. And we have some follow-up meetings with them, which is really exciting. And the additional recommendations that we wanted to make sure that we highlighted were creating partnerships with schools and these cultural knowledge holders in the community, making sure that anyone that participates in the working groups are compensated for their resources and time. That is a big thing to make sure that we're not taking advantage of individuals and their knowledge, and then having true professional development for our educators so that they can learn what they're teaching students moving forward. So all of that is that we envision the resources and experiences for PBE and SHE in a pre-K 12 environment across disciplines. So it doesn't happen just in social studies classes, it happens in science classes, it happens in math classes, it happens in civics courses. And through that, we hope to see increased learning outcomes, higher levels of engagement for the school and community, and a development of self-identity and self-efficacy for students. Whew. And that was my really quick run through for questions. And I think we're going to open it up if we have time. I'm looking to Dr. Wright for questions for all three of us. So, or three groups. If anyone has any questions, we have, I think, a few minutes.
Yes. So I'm going to ask that if that we take one question right now. If it's a burning question, you can either speak up to your mic or type it into the chat. prior to speaking with Brian in his presentation, and then there will be some time afterwards to ask Brian some questions of his presentation and maybe of the group here. So again, at the moment, I'll ask if there is a question that someone wants to ask any of these groups. Okay. Well, with that, we can move on. And again, if there are additional questions, again, you can type them into the chat as we go along, or you can wait until the last portion. Okay. So with that being said, thank you to our PhD students. Great presentation. We greatly appreciate your work that you did over the summer and also sharing that information with us. Our second speaker today is Brian A. Williams, who is a recent EDD graduate from the School of Education. Brian wants to see students get the most out of their college experiences. Throughout his career, he's advised students through the adventures of their academic programs so they can fulfill their personal and professional goals beyond graduation. That's why it's such a heartbreak to see students who are often pressured for high grades with limited time and money go through administrative discipline for acts of academic dishonesty like plagiarism. So Brian has dedicated his career to encourage academic integrity at every opportunity. You can learn more about Brian from his LinkedIn profile, linkedin.com, Brian Alexander Williams. Today, Brian will be speaking about understanding risk factors for plagiarism among MBA students at a Northeastern U.S. research university. So at this time, I would like to welcome Brian to share his screen and present his information. Thank you.
Start the presentation. Okay. Dr. Wright, thank you very much for the introduction. To the Drexel students and alum, welcome. And to the community at large, welcome. Thank you for being here today. I'm really excited to share my recent findings after defending my dissertation in March of this year. And my dissertation surrounded the topic of academic dishonesty, specifically plagiarism. So today I'll be talking about understanding risk factors for plagiarism among MBA students at a Northeastern U.S. research university. So I included an abstract as a part of my brief, and I just want to share it here. So the purpose of this mixed method study was to examine MBA students' perceptions and motivations for plagiarism, and to identify plagiarism risk factors at a Northeastern U.S. research university. And I gave it shorthand of NIRU for this study. NIRU MBA students engaged in plagiarism at rates which threatened program completion. Continuing, this research gathered quantitative and qualitative data from 58 currently enrolled MBA students. The data analysis revealed no difference in male and female plagiarism rates, as well as 21 open codes whose categorical groupings depicted students' progressions through the program. And I have that underlined there because that's one of the more interesting findings that I'll talk about later on in the presentation. The research implications included equal representation between full and part-time students. I'd be also looking for finer levels of measurement on the Likert scale, as well as a greater focus on the interview protocol. And I'll talk about these items again later on as we progress. Looking at the study design and the methodology, so I mentioned explanatory sequential design. I have a graphic to show everyone what that looks like for this study. This mixed method study, I collected quantitative data through electronic survey to the population of interest at NIRU, and qualitative data collection happened with individual interviews via Zoom, and that was done in accordance to COVID-19 protocol. Purpose and significance, the purpose of this study was to examine and explore the students' perceptions and motivations for plagiarism to identify the risk factors for plagiarism at NIRU. The findings of this study could potentially help in curriculum development and delivery approaches, as well as the improvement of existing or establishment of new academic integrity policies. So what was happening at NERU, the students were engaging in plagiarism and unknown risk factors. And the result of that was students were being threatened with program completion. And that background information, those data came from the reported cases of the Division of Student Affairs at the university. The goal, again, I want to come up with a list of risk factors, those items that kind of give indication that a student could be susceptible to the negative condition of plagiarism. And I did that based on quantitative and qualitative data from those MBA students. And so the goals for this study answer the research questions. I'll just go over my 3 questions here. The first question is, how do MBA students at NERU describe their perceptions of plagiarism? Number 2, is there a significant difference in the frequency of plagiarism cases between males and females at the university? The null hypothesis says there was not a significant difference between those 2 groups. And the alternative hypothesis says there is a significant difference between those 2 groups. The third question asks, how do MBA students at NERU describe their motivations? What really were the reasons behind engaging in plagiarism? We'll explore those. So approaching my conceptual framework, I learned in reading through the literature that Solomon from 2018 said that academic dishonesty is an umbrella term. It's a broad term. And within academic dishonesty are found specific acts. And one of those acts was plagiarism. And that's the way I constructed my conceptual framework. I started with a broad overview of academic dishonesty, as well as gender and dishonesty, moving on to motivating factors for academic dishonesty. From there, I narrowed my focus specifically to plagiarism, where I looked at an overview of plagiarism, gender and plagiarism, and those motivating factors for plagiarism. From there, I was able to derive an understanding of risk factors for plagiarism among MBA students at the university. So I mentioned a little bit earlier, this was an explanatory sequential mixed method study. So what does that mean? What are we talking about explanatory sequential? Well, sequence, we're moving down a particular path and we're accomplishing goals along the way. So what that means here is I first started collecting quantitative data through the electronic surveys aimed at currently enrolled MBA students. When the results started to trickle in, I looked at them and I wanted to gain an understanding of what those data were saying to me. And I had some questions. I had some items I needed to sort out and to get more clarification on. For example, the literature broadly stated that men plagiarize more than women. However, what I found as data were coming in was that, women are plagiarizing more than men. Well, what's going on with that? So I needed to find out. I then followed up with qualitative data collection. Now, here is where I'm starting to get the explanation, the explanatory part of the sequence, where I'm asking students through interviews, you know, the literature says men plagiarize more than women. However, I'm getting the opposite effect. Why do you suppose that is? What do you think could be happening? From there, students gave me their ideas of what could be going on from their own perspective. Finishing up with an interpretation where I will go over some of my findings. I want to just go over the aim. Again, mentioned identify those risk factors, answer the research questions. I did that by exploring how students defined plagiarism, and they didn't disappoint. They gave me varied definitions and its associated acts. We explored their motivations, and I found that really the top 3 were related to time, money, and grades. I also wanted to see if there was a difference between male and female plagiarism rates. So let's take a few steps back and we'll look at a broader view of academic dishonesty and what is really fueling this study. I discovered that it's been growing over the past 20 years with the help of technological advancements. Traditional responses to academic dishonesty haven't really slowed its rate of occurrence. Those responses being lowered or failed grades, failed courses, and expulsion from the school. I mentioned earlier from Solomon that plagiarism is a specific act of academic dishonesty. And that plagiarism also affected the graduation rates of the MBA students at NERU. This study from Yang and Harrington from 2020, I looked at it and was inspired to look at risk factors. And we usually hear of risk factors associated with healthcare and different diseases. For example, heart disease. There are risk factors associated with heart disease. For example, if you're a certain age, if there are genetics in your family for it, if you're Black, if you smoke, your diet, those can be contributing factors for heart disease. Well, I wanted to discover in this study, what are risk factors that can make students susceptible for plagiarism? And again, from the literature, males generally engaged in plagiarism more than females. So that's just some of the context that I was looking at. And the research questions. Research question 1, perceptions of plagiarism. Students reported it's a bad practice and it should be avoided. There were negative consequences associated with plagiarism as well, such as expulsion, becoming an outcast among one's peers, feelings of defeat, as well as the possible need to explain academic shortcomings to one's employer. Students went on to talk about benefits of plagiarism. I have benefits in quotes because in the face of a bad practice and negative consequence, is it really a benefit? Nevertheless, students talked about it. They talked about recapturing time, reaching their goals easier and faster through the MBA program and beyond, as well as the big one, alleviating stress. For the second research question, the analysis produced no difference in the frequency of male and female plagiarism rates. That's to say no significant difference. Looking at the third research question, those motivations for plagiarism, I found some socially oriented ones, such as maintaining peer relationships, and students wanted to appear competent in front of peers. But there were some self-oriented motivations for plagiarism as well, such as stress reduction and just seizing an opportunity and taking advantage of that opportunity to plagiarize. So now I'm looking at the interesting research findings. It was so interesting, I have it in bold because I want so I get excited about it. I found open codes. And I was able to produce 24 of them, 21 of which were categorized into an organizational chart. And I just have to admit, going through the whole research process and the analysis, this is where a magical moment happened, where I said, I'm really onto something. I'm onto what these stories really mean from the students' points of view regarding plagiarism. And so I arranged those codes into an organizational chart that depicted a possible progression through the MBA program. And I'll show you what that chart's about. First, I want to just go over an example of some of those open codes that I discovered. I have a few listed in green, so I'll just go over those very quickly. If we look at number 4, not learning material. This is when a student fails to learn an academic subject sufficiently enough to perform well in an advanced course or professionally due to plagiarism. And number 6, grade orientation. That's the condition in which a student's motivations for academic performance is the class's final assessment on the permanent academic record. So this is that organizational chart. I've taken those open codes and I've arranged them. And I mentioned earlier that they were done categorically. And you can see the categories on the left side, the overarching pressures, and those are listed to the right. Number 2, the considerations before plagiarism. Number 3, the basic plagiarism elements. And number 4, the effects of plagiarism. So what I want to do here is take you through a possible progression of a student who's considering plagiarism. Let's say they come into the program and they're feeling some pressures. Perhaps in the student's case, they're concerned about money. They don't want to lose money. Money's limited for everyone, which is understandable. Here, the student could consider, how important is this class for me? And they could place a low level of importance by saying, well, this class is not really important for future schoolwork, and it's not really important for my job. So it's not that important to me in general, low level of importance. From there, students consider what plagiarism is, what it means, and in this case, they're just looking for an easy way out. They want to get through the class as easily as they can. If they navigate that successfully, then they are that much closer to fulfilling the purpose of the MBA program. Here's another quick example. Let's say a student comes into the program with some pressures. In this case, they have a high grade orientation. I just want to keep my perfect 4.0 GPA in this program. They could look at the quality of the relationships they have in their courses. Do I have someone in this class who can help me with a paper, or who might let me look at their homework? Student might have time dividers happening outside of academics. They're coaching their kids' sports team, or they have a lot of extra work happening, and they can't dedicate as much time as they like to their academics. And they might also know, this professor's a little bit relaxed in this class and might not be rigorous enough to check. From there, what is plagiarism? And what does it mean to me? In this case, I just don't want to get caught. If I can get through this class and not get caught, then that's what's important. Again, if they navigate that, they are that much closer to fulfilling the MBA. Now, this concept of duality was very interesting to me, because I'll just put the first one up here. As I interviewed students, I couldn't help but to feel internally this pull, sort of pull over here and pull over here. Students were saying one thing and doing something else. I couldn't really understand what that was until I took a closer look at what some of the elements within their speech meant. I will try to present some of those here, talking about duality. So in the first one, we were talking about grades, time, and money. Grades are permanent on the transcript. Money is something we all need to pay for school. Time affects everyone and never stops. Those are persistent elements. However, those elements which are changeable once time dividers or activities that draw attention away from academics, one's level of laziness, the level of importance a person appends to a class, those are changeable. The double-edged sword, plagiarism on one hand allows for an easier and faster progression. On the other hand, if caught, they can be expelled with consequences. The present and the future. So short-sightedness says, I want my reward right now. I just need to get through this assignment. I need to get through this class. I need to do it with my reward now. But the future says, you suffer the aftermath because you're ill-prepared for future classwork and performing on the job. It depends. It depends. Those situational factors that can lead a student to plagiarize, which is a negative practice. But just let me go back to like sort of conventional thinking. Conventional thinking kind of says, you know, if something's a negative practice, then participate in it. But again, that's not what I was getting. And what led students to engage in it, that was the it depends factor. The internal and external, this really refers more to my chapter 2, my literature review. And some of the motivations given in literature, I saw as internal, such as you can have an internal desire to maintain peer relationships. You can also have peers on the outside of you sort of badgering you to engage in a cheating relationship. So those internal, external motivations. And then there's something for nothing, obtaining a higher quality of life for virtually nothing. That duality sort of was pushing me like this, and I wanted to show that here. So I mentioned earlier, the risk factors for plagiarism. There are 13, and I will display what they are. Number 1 is deficiency of time. 2 is a high grade orientation. The third one is a fear of losing money. Again, those are those big three ones that. Number 4, deficiencies in one skill set. 5 is laziness. 6 is short-sightedness. Give me my rewards now, but risks. High quality relationships. Number 8 is a desire to appear confident. Number 9 is a perception of too much schoolwork. 10 is relaxed professors. 11 is a desire for something for nothing. Number 12 is ascribing low importance to schoolwork. And the final one is a low concern of getting caught. So just a little bit more discussion. Plagiarism was found to be a bad practice that should be avoided. There were negative consequences associated that could ruin students' goals for the program. However, students were willing to risk those sanctions to reap the benefits, such as recapture time and stress reduction. And also wrapping up the male and female rates of plagiarism. Based on the literature, being male was thought to be a risk factor. However, I didn't find any significant difference between those two groups. Therefore, being male could not be considered a risk factor within this study. Students wanted to improve their lives via better jobs with increased salaries. Grades, time, and money remained the primary motivations towards plagiarism. And some research implications, interestingly, this study was aimed towards full and part-time students. However, only the part-time student population responded. Full-timers did not. I think that's an important consideration because how does the element of time become portrayed between the two groups? So full-time students, generally younger, less likely to have families, and they don't work full-time while dedicating all their time to schoolwork. You contrast that profile to the part-time students who usually work full-time, or a little bit older and are more likely to have families. Well, time plays an important factor, as you can see, between those two populations. So how would that play out? Equal representation would level that playing field. Finer levels of measurement on the Likert scale. So currently I used once and more than once when scoring. And it worked for this study, but I would be looking for, in the future, adding more levels, a finer level of measurement, not only to include once, but 2 times, 3 times, 4 or more times. And I think what that does is it gives a finer picture of who could be plagiarizing more between males and females. In the same way that it's like DPI, the dots per inch. More DPI, you have a finer, more clearer picture. The interview protocol, explain thoughts about grade times and money, or time, grades, and money rather, but also focus on why students enter the program. And I think that would reveal the weight of why students are plagiarizing and the risk if they are caught. So wrapping up, thank you for listening. And just looking at questions and answers, I would ask to maybe project some items that you might have questions about. For example, you might have a reaction to no difference in the frequency of plagiarism cases between males and females. Or regarding duality, perhaps it was hyperbolic. Maybe I was placing more importance on looking at 2 sides of the same coin because that's common and expected to everything. So just a few things to look at regarding the study. Again, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Brian. So at this point, we will take questions from our attendees. So I have a question, Brian, if you don't mind. Did you find, so throughout your work, was there any exploration of what qualified or what counted as plagiarism? Like, was there a difference between whether someone said, I took an entire excerpt of a book versus one line? So was there any discussion as far as how people may have had a shared understanding of what it meant to plagiarize in your work, do you know?
They definitely did. And through all the discussion, I was able to distill the elements of plagiarism. And it came down to 3 elements, and these were consistent with Saheen, I believe from 2016. But those elements were acquiring a work, using that work, and an attribution aspect. And the attribution aspect, either you attributed the source of that acquired work or you didn't. And failing to attribute the source of that work was what really constituted plagiarism. I don't believe we talked very much about the amount of a used or the amount of an acquired work, because I mean, it's permissible to use other people's work within your own work if you give proper attribution. I also believe through plagiarism checkers such as turnitin.com, it will give you a report of the percentage of outside or sourced work within your paper. And professors will vary for the amount that is tolerable within their class for how much you have used within your own work. So yes, while it was mentioned, I was able to distill and break down those 3 elements, again, consistent with what's in literature. I did want to mention also, just as a point of clarification, earlier, one of the items that was a concern was becoming an outcast among peers. But then I also talked about maintaining peer relationships, so that there's that duality happening again, that sort of pull to the left and right. There was one student who talked about, I guess, the feelings that she had internally from engaging in plagiarism, and how that made her feel to herself. And really, if discovered, how the other students would then ostracize her, or how she has seen ostracization happen with other students. And that's how they become outcasts. But on the other hand, if there's a friend, and that goes back to those high quality relationships, if you have a friend who is willing to engage in plagiarism or academic dishonesty with you, then saying yes to that maintains the relationship. So we're looking at kind of both sides of the same coin again, in accordance to the whole duality idea.
Are there any additional questions from anyone? Okay, so if not, so it's about 2 minutes left. So I would like to thank our presenters today, Kimberly, Christopher, Dara, Kate, Katrina, and Dr. Williams for presenting today. And I would like to thank all of you for attending the colloquium event series. The next colloquium event will be on Friday, November the 5th, again from 12 to 1. So again, thank you, and have a good rest of your weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.